Good evening, everyone, and thanks for the introduction, Elisa. In anticipation of the actual awarding of the Lynd Ward Prize, I'd like to introduce the jurors and say a few words explaining why we selected the winning graphic novel as well as the honor book. We'll use this. It's not working. I will continue. That would be great. Each member of the jury has a connection to both Penn State as well as a connection to graphic novels. Thank you. Whether they are makers, readers, teachers, or all of the above. To begin with my own story, I'm a Penn State architecture alum, and I'm currently an architect at IKM in Pittsburgh. I first started reading comics in college and haven't slowed down yet. And in fact, I married the owner of the comic shop this summer, so that's working out pretty well. Besides myself, for books, we have many books. Besides myself, 4 others served on this year's jury. And if you want to stand, feel free. Brian Alfred, Brooklyn-based artist and teaching fellow at the Penn State School of Visual Arts. You don't have to stand if you don't want to. But now I've kind of obligated you to, so sorry about that. Maria Burchill, head of SCLO Center Region Library Adult Services. And applause. Elise DeVeni, undergraduate student pursuing film, English, and theater studies. And finally, Stephen Herb, who unfortunately couldn't be here tonight due to pressing literary business, but he's the director emeritus of the Pennsylvania Center for the Book and lead founder of the Lynd Ward Prize. And now we get to the good stuff. After much deliberation and lively debate, On a Sunbeam by Tilly Walden was selected as the solo honor book for this year. In the words of the jury, On a Sunbeam, a love epic traveling through space and time, comes alive through sublime art that sweeps the reader through a vibrant, lush world of Walden's invention. It's a stunning exploration of space, identity, and love that is aesthetically sophisticated and connects to feelings of intimacy and escapism. This brings us to our 2019 Lynd Ward Prize winner, Belonging by Nora Krug, who we're very excited to have here today. In the jury's words, Belonging is an examination of culpability. The graphic memoir follows Nora through Germany and history as she uncovers her family's participation in World War II and the impact the war continues to have on the generations that have followed. The jury chose this particular narrative for the North American-based Lynd Ward Prize for its genuine richness and innovation, and also because of its cultural contribution. This is the last generation who will know Holocaust survivors. Fear exists that magnitude of this atrocity will dim in North American collective memory as history pulls further away from us. In Belonging, there is no fading of memory, but rather a vivid immersion into it as Nora processes the echoes of World War II in her own life. The composition exhibits thorough and innovative research and asks honest questions. Ms. Krug's language is poetic, and her assemblage of fading photographs, letters, and vibrant illustrations evoke a palimpsest of history and memory. Employing collage in tandem with her personal illustration style, she negotiates historical space with her own artistic vision. This graphic memoir feels part diary, part archival record, and the outcome is both personal and educational, about German identity and about the collective cultural aftermath of the Holocaust. I'm now delighted to present to Nora the Library of America's 6 novels and woodcuts by Lynd Ward and the award prize. Thank you so much, Nora, and congratulations.
Hello, thank you so much for the introduction, for this prize. I'm really honored to receive it and to be able to be here tonight. Thank you to the jury, to Penn State University Libraries and the Pennsylvania Center for the book, and also all the co-sponsors, and also to Lynd Ward for inspiring so many graphic artists working today. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what drove me to write and illustrate this book, and then I'll do a little reading from the book itself. Drawing to me means observing, documenting, and reflecting the world around us. What interests me most about illustration as a medium is its political potential. Illustrations have always reflected our need to position ourselves in society. And throughout history, they've been used to cement our social hierarchies, religious systems, and moral codes. And because of this, illustrations simultaneously reflect and influence not who we are, but who we believe ourselves to be, and how we want to be seen from the outside. Obviously, illustrations make no claims to objectivity. They always say as much about their creator as they say about the world that they depict. Here's an interesting example from the mid-19th century. When the American Navy forced its way into Japan after a 200-year-long period of strict isolation, this is how an American artist illustrated the Navy's arrival. And this is how the Japanese depicted the same historic event. The American commander Perry was illustrated like this by a Western artist at the time, and this is how a Japanese artist depicted him. In its most extreme, illustration can of course be abused as a propagandistic tool to communicate negative stereotypes of that which is perceived as foreign or different. This anti-Semitic motif, showing a Jewish man in obscene contact with a pig, was used across Europe, predominantly in Germany during the Middle Ages, to intimidate and to exclude a religious minority. It was printed in books or chiseled into church walls in recurring variations. Often, an illustration of a dead child can be seen at the top of this type of image, depicting the alleged ritual murder of a Christian child through Jewish men and women, a sort of medieval version of a piece of fake news visual journalism. And of course, the Nazis picked up on some of this propaganda in the 1930s and 40s, using the word Judensau, Jewish pig, but also developing their own anti-Semitic imagery, such as this one. As an illustrator, I reflect a lot on this problematic history of my particular medium. And when I work, I think about the political responsibility we have as illustrators. And I ask myself what we can do to contribute to dismantling these kinds of cultural stereotypes, and to perhaps provide a new entry point for understanding political ideas and perspectives. During the past 10 years, I've been creating a series of visual biographies about the lives of people who've experienced war firsthand, which has allowed me to combine my interests in visual history, illustration, literature, and documentary film. In these stories, I focus on the lives of people who are more or less unknown, because they came out of the wars neither as heroes nor as villains. I'm interested in what war does to those who move in the gray zones of war, whose lives are perceived as neither inspiring nor deterring enough to be reported on, whose guilt or innocence is difficult to prove or measure. My story, Fukutsu, talks about a Japanese soldier called Hiro Onoda, who was stationed on the Philippines during World War II, and who fled to the jungle when the Americans arrived and continued living there for 29 years, firmly believing that the war was still going on. No Man's Land tells the story of an American soldier named Charles Robert Jenkins, who was stationed at the demilitarized zone in South Korea in the 1960s as a young soldier. Afraid of being sent to Vietnam, he fled across to North Korea, where he was seized and forced to remain. When released after 39 years, he returned to the US and was tried as a deserter by the US military court, but later pardoned. And this comic, Kamikaze, tells the story about a Japanese soldier named Ina Takehiko, who was drafted into the Kamikaze unit during World War II against his will, and who survived the attack due to an unexpected engine failure. He lives in Japan today as a retired soybean exporter. Researching these people's lives and illustrating these stories allowed me to gain a more tangible understanding of what it's like to experience war. my book Belonging is a direct result of all of these projects, previous projects. It was only after I had worked on my series of short narratives that I realized that all this time I had been subconsciously avoiding to tell the story of war from a German point of view, because as someone representing the country of the perpetrators, I felt like I had no right to tell it. Belonging is a 280-page, fully illustrated and hand-lettered visual memoir about World War II and my own German family history. The atrocities my country committed during World War II cast a long shadow all throughout my childhood, and my years as a teenager were accompanied by a tremendous sense of inherited guilt. But even though we continuously learned about the Holocaust in school, even though we regularly went on field trips to concentration camp museums, spoke to survivors, analyzed Adolf Hitler's speeches word by word, the paper on the left is the actual sheet from my high school exercise book, where we analyzed one of his speeches. The guilt we grew into remained abstract, and conversations about what happened in our own families were non-existent. By the time I learned about the Holocaust in school, around the age of 12 or 13, all my grandparents had died, and I had missed my chance to ask them directly about their lives under the Nazi regime. My parents, both of whom were born in 1946, knew equally little about their parents' involvement in the war, because the subject had never really been raised at home. My guilt and the gaping hole that was my family's history left me with a feeling of emotional paralysis, and this paralysis went in tandem with a feeling of cultural disorientation. Because my cultural identity was so deeply entangled with my country's past, I grew up rejecting any notion of a German tradition, leaving me not to take pride in any of my country's cultural achievements that existed long before the Nazis came to power. My friends and I never learned old folk songs. We struck the words for hero and pride from our vocabularies. We never learned the lyrics to our national anthem, and we watched with relief when the players of the German soccer team remained silent as the anthem was played before kickoff. At age 19, I left Germany to study, first in England and then in the US. And during the 21 years of my living abroad, I was often confronted with negative stereotypes about my home country. And I've often been aware that my accent alone can evoke the memory of the Nazis' crimes. As a German in a foreign land, I felt more German than ever before. And I felt a growing urge to confront my own family's history in a new way and to ask those questions I never had a chance to ask before. Belonging follows my search for my family and their wartime history, and concurrent to that, my search for what it means to be German. Through a combination of short comics, full-page illustrations, and photographs, the book charts my search for my own family, whose war experience and political attitude I knew nothing about before I embarked on the project, and connected to that, my quest for what German cultural identity really means to me. The book follows my journey as I seek out lost relatives in the village where my father grew up, track down old family homes, and consult local archives for the smallest bit of information and the tiniest scrap of paper I could find that would provide any evidence about my family's life under the Nazi regime. The particular focus of the narrative is my maternal grandfather, a driving teacher in my hometown, Karlsruhe, in the southwest of Germany, during the war, and my paternal uncle, who died as an SS soldier in Italy at age 19. Their stories are intertwined throughout the book, and their narratives are equally driven by words and images. I began the process of working on the book 6.5 years ago with extensive research and focused on the writing entirely for 2 years, and finally created the images to go along with the text. My goal was not to translate the writing into images one-to-one, but to use pictures to add an additional emotional dimension to the story. One that allows the reader a more emotional, direct access into the narrative. Even though I always begin my process by writing rather than drawing, I don't believe there to be a hierarchy between the two mediums. To me, they represent two components which complement each other and which aim to emphasize the complexity of the German war experience. For this particular book, it was especially important to weigh the text and the images carefully in order to avoid a sense of sentimentality or the impression that I was trying to create false sympathy for the Germans. At moments in my book where my writing was more elaborate, I therefore chose to make the image recede in the background And when an image conveyed a lot of emotion, I chose to keep the language simple and stripped down. I used photography when it seemed more important to represent an exact moment in history, an illustration where I had to rely on my own imagination and interpretation because no visual historic evidence was available, or because I felt that a particular moment in the narrative called for a more poetic approach. Interwoven into the family narrative are pages that I entitled "From the Scrapbook of a Memory Archivist," which feature objects, letters, and photographs from the 1930s and 40s that I found at flea markets across Germany over the years of my search. Things that provided the tangible, evidential experience of war that my own grandparents and uncle weren't able to provide me with. These pages are arranged thematically throughout the narrative. Similarly, the book contains encyclopedic pages called "From the Notebook of a Homesick Emigree, Things German," which catalog objects, activities, and places which, to me, are deeply rooted in the German consciousness, aspects of my culture that were often misappropriated by the Nazis and whose emotional meaning I only became aware of during my working on the book while living far away from Germany and looking at it from a distance. To me, drawing is an act of empathy. Illustrating forces me to make historic events and processes visible. By illustrating my grandfather's and uncle's stories and memories, I can picture more clearly the situations they found themselves in during the war, while I test the limits of my own empathy towards the decisions they made. By creating images to illustrate my family's history, I created a visual chart that I hoped would help me navigate my way back to aspects of the country that I feel that I've lost. The main theme of belonging is identity, my own identity, my family's identity, and the identity of my country, which remains so difficult to grasp. On a more universal level, I try to gain a clearer understanding of the effect that history has over generations and of the role that the memory of war, collective and personal, plays in the shaping of cultural identity. I'm now going to read chapter 3 from the book. Which is entitled "Poisonous Mushrooms." Every year we went to Italy for a family vacation. To us, Italy represented everything Germany didn't have, or perhaps elements it once had but lost in the perfectionist reconstruction of the post-war years. Here we could feel uninhibited and live the exotic fantasy of Southern European life. We spent days driving around in our non-air-conditioned green Volvo, exploring small medieval towns, sampling local delicacies, visiting remote museums, and following in the footsteps of famous artists, writers, and filmmakers. On one of those excursions, we came upon a large military cemetery. The cemetery's geometric precision was intimidating. Near the entrance, we found an inscription in German. Selig sind, die da Leid tragen, denn sie sollen getröstet werden. Blessed are they who are suffering, for they shall be comforted. Buried beneath our feet lay the bodies of not Italian, but German World War II soldiers. A few decades after the end of the war, 30,683 of them had been dug up from nearby provisional graves for identification and finally reburied here. The cemetery was vast. We made our way through the labyrinth in silence. Suddenly, my father disappeared. After a while, we spotted him in the distance. He walked briskly and held a piece of paper in his hand. "What are you looking for?" "My brother." I'd always known that I had an uncle who died young, at age 18. He fell in the war, my father used to say, but nobody in my family seemed to know how or where he was killed. I knew that my uncle had been the heir to my grandparents' land in Kölsheim, a tiny town in southwest Germany, surrounded by fields, forests, and vineyards. I knew that my father was born a few years after my uncle's death, and that his parents had named him Franz Karl, after his dead brother. I knew that because my uncle had died, they expected my father to inherit and tend to their farm, to look after the animals, the fields, and the plum trees. And I knew that my father had never fulfilled that expectation. As a child, I discovered a musty-smelling box in the drawer of the mahogany cabinet in our living room. It contained old photographs of my uncle and a few of his sixth grade school exercise books. Their stories describe the life cycle of the Maybug and the history of European forestry, the heroic Viking adventures and the havoc of the 30 Years' War, the importance of charity and the necessity for personal hygiene, the Führer's difficult childhood and his reintroduction of Mother's Day to celebrate German women and their Aryan children. Number 2, how I honored my darling mother. When I woke up on Mother's Day, I quickly got out of bed and put on my clothes. Then quickly into the garden to pick a bunch of flowers, which I put next to Mother's bed. When she woke up, I gave her my best Mother's Day wishes. Then I went out into the kitchen and put a cup on the table for her. On the cup it said Mother's Day. I also put a piece of cake on the table. At noon, I went into the forest and picked a bunch of mayflowers for her. Kölsheim, May 31st, 1938. All throughout my father's childhood, his mother told him that his brother had been a sweet and well-behaved boy. Unlike my father, who was a stubborn and ill-tempered child. My father skipped days of kindergarten, then skipped school, playing all by himself on the grounds of Kölsheim's medieval castle. My uncle was a complete stranger to me. I didn't know anyone who had known him. War and death were the only things I associated with him. Because he had been one of Hitler's soldiers, I learned early on that I wasn't supposed to feel sadness over his premature death. His photos and exercise books were the only physical evidence of his existence, and I tried desperately to find him somewhere in between the lines of his propagandistic essays. It was like searching a concrete wall for cracks and leaks. Examining the stories written in my uncle's neat handwriting and the illustrations with which he carefully decorated the margins was an intimate but chilling experience. The books intrigued me, but I never showed them to any of my friends. Number 11, the Jew, a poisonous mushroom. When you go to the forest and you see mushrooms that look beautiful, you think that they are good. But when you eat them, they are poisonous and can kill a whole family. The Jew is just like this mushroom. When you see the Jew from behind, you don't immediately recognize him. But if you talk to him, you recognize him immediately. He pretends to be nice and flatters you shamelessly. Just like the poisonous mushroom can kill a whole family, the Jew can kill a whole people. Kölsheim, January 20th, 1939. From the notebook of a homesick emigre, Things German, number 3, Das Pilze sammeln. Collecting mushrooms with my family, examining each mushroom carefully and comparing it to the corresponding picture in the Pilzführer mushroom guidebook before placing it in the woven basket. Back home, scrubbing off the bits of earth on the stem and in between the gills, and then sauteing the mushrooms in a pan with butter, salt, and pepper, and eating them with a piece of dark rye bread. By eating the mushrooms, I feel as if I've become part of the forest. The poisonous red-white polka-dotted mushroom is depicted in many German children's books. On New Year's Day, it is a symbol of good luck that appears on greeting cards and in marzipan sweets made in its shape. My mother dressed as a poisonous mushroom, 1953. Costume made by my grandmother. To this day, she remembers the moment the picture was taken because of how disappointed she was that she couldn't be a princess instead. My uncle signed his name beneath the mushroom story and added the date, January 20th, 1939. On that same day, the mayor of Dachau reports that his town is now cleared of all Jews. A hearing in Berlin takes place about the sterilization of a mentally unstable woman. Stalin endorses the use of torture. And Joseph Goebbels writes in his diary, "Talked things through with the Führer for 2 hours. He's so good and humane to me. One has to love him." 10 days later, Adolf Hitler will give a speech proclaiming that if Jewish financiers should plunge the nations into a world war yet again, the outcome will be the annihilation of the Jewish race in Europe. Was my uncle's story influenced by The Poisonous Mushroom, the 1938 collection of anti-Semitic children's stories? The book was given out for free by the National Socialists. In one of the stories, a mother and her blonde, lederhosen-clad son go for a walk in the forest, where she compares Jews to poisonous mushrooms. Coincidentally, the name of the boy in the story was Franz, the same name as my uncle's. It takes great effort to learn to write. How much effort did it take my uncle to write a story like the one about the mushroom? Content B, spelling C+, calligraphy C. The teacher marked 3 spelling mistakes and 2 grammatical mistakes in the mushroom story and signed it ST. Although he expected my uncle to do better, he was satisfied with the story's content. Adolf Hitler, 1938. Our youth shall learn nothing but to think German and to act German. A young boy or a young girl enters into our organizations at age 10, then they move on from the junior Hitler Youth to the Hitler Youth 4 years later, and will keep them there for another 4 years, and then put them into the Party or the Labor Front, the Assault Division or the SS. And if there's still a bit of class consciousness and elitist thinking left in them, they'll receive further treatment from the armed forces. And when they return after 2 or 3 or 4 years, we'll put them back into the Assault Division or SS so that they won't relapse. And they shall never be free again for the rest of their lives. My uncle in 1939, with a goat given to him for First Communion. My uncle was born in 1926. In 1936, the National Socialists announced that 90% of all children born in 1926 had successfully been recruited into the Hitler Youth. By 1939, joining had become mandatory. Hülsheim is a small town. Jews and Christians lived side by side, engaged in trade for centuries. My uncle probably knew the Jewish boys and girls who lived in town. He was 12 years old when he wrote the story in his exercise book. Too young to understand the power of Nazi propaganda, but old enough to understand that Jews are not like poisonous mushrooms. From the scrapbook of a memory archivist, flea market find number 1, Child's Play. A, caricature of a Jew, 20 cents. B, toy made in the honor of the Führer's birthday, 4 euros. C, Hitler Youth trading cards, set of 10, 2 euros. D, roaches given in exchange for winter relief donations, 4 euros. E, primer, 1 euro. When I finally caught up with my father at the cemetery, it turned out that he had walked up to its chapel and, for reasons unknown even to himself, had scanned the names in the register. There, among the thousands of names his eyes rested on for a fraction of a second, names that had once been called from kitchen windows at dinner time, names written on Christmas gifts and school exercise books, names spoken severely in classrooms, names pronounced ceremoniously by mayors on enlistment day, names whispered by girls and women the night before departure, names shouted out on the battlefield when a response could no longer be expected, names reported to superiors, names spelled out on clacking typewriters in colonel secretaries' offices, names read, reread and read again on damp military stationery, names chiseled into stones, names remembered quietly by mothers and fathers before a final breath was taken. Among all these unfamiliar names belonging to people unknown to him, my father found what he had been looking for, his own name. The number on the piece of paper my father was holding specified the exact location of my uncle's grave. The gravestone was meticulously maintained. Inscribed on it was the name that my uncle and my father had always shared. For the first time, I experienced the loss of my uncle's life in a physical way. Briefly, he emerged from the depths of the heavy mahogany cabinet, not as a shadow, but as a human being whose eyes I could have looked into and said, "Uncle," who could have given me a goat as a gift for First Communion, whose children's outgrown clothes I could have worn, and to whom I could have sent a postcard from Italy that summer, telling him about our visit to a German World War II cemetery that was filled with gravestones inscribed with the names of total strangers. Standing at his grave, I longed to understand what it had felt like to be him. Was he proud to fight in the war? Was he afraid? What was the last thing he saw, the last thought he had? This is the closest I've ever been to my brother, my father said. Two photographs placed on top of each other match perfectly. Two arms, each holding a First Communion candle. Two arms, each holding a hymn book. The new face that emerges looks directly at me. Thank you. Staying here. Okay. Does anybody have a question?
I had a question about the lettering in the book. So you said it was all hand lettering. This is more of a technical question, I guess, but can you describe the process of, what tools you use, what kind of challenges that presented for editing and planning the book? Because obviously with handwriting, you can't go in and alter it as easy electronically. So I was just curious about the lettering process.
Yeah, so only the American and British editions are hand lettered. All the foreign editions use a font that's based on my hand lettering, and which means that my job, unfortunately, is not done yet because I have to work with designers in every country on each of the foreign editions to oversee every single page and the way the text, flows around the image and the distance between the different lines and the color of the text. But the American edition was challenging because, as you said, whenever there's an editorial change, you have to basically re-letter the entire page because you don't want there to be a gap. So in order to avoid that, for the most part, I decided to only focus on the writing for 2 years. And I worked with my editor at Scribner's, who basically line edited my entire book. And when we both felt like it was ready to be illustrated and that the text and the narrative was in place, I started with the illustration. So actually there were very few changes at the end to the text, but there were certain pages where I had to make final changes, and that just meant re-lettering those individual pages. And it's definitely something I won't ever do again. Yeah, I love pencils. I use pencil for most of my drawings as well because it's so organic. And so I did it all by hand on paper with pencil. Yes.
Who is your audience in Germany? Your father's contemporaries or yours, or a combination?
So it's a combination. I would say when I do readings in Germany, I would say the audience is mostly composed of people of my generation and older. Unfortunately, there have been fewer younger people there. And I don't think it's the subject matter. I think it's the reading, the fact that fewer and fewer young people read. And but that being said, the German government has issued 3 educational editions of the book that are made available to educators in Germany at a cheaper price so that they can be used in classrooms. And it's also nominated for a prize at the moment for the German Youth Literature Prize, which means that there is a potential for it to be used in schools. So I hope that will change. But the response in Germany in particular has been enormously positive, which makes me feel really hopeful because it shows me that most Germans feel the way I do, which is that you have to continue facing the past and talking about it and thinking about it. And so that's been a very nice confirmation. But I hope that younger generations will embrace it as well. So we just, I don't know if it was audible in the back, but we just heard that Lynd Ward approached text and image the opposite way, which meaning that he began with the illustrations and then walked around with a notepad and pen in his studio and thought about the words. And it's always really interesting to me how differently illustrators work and think. And even though, you know, that there tends to be a, there tend to be or artists who begin with the drawing and then other artists who begin with the writing. I think probably in all artists' minds, the image, you know, the visual and the literary are not so separate. So even when you only focus on one, in your head, you're already considering the other. And so it's always interesting for me to hear about other artists' processes. You heard that, I think, right? Okay, I can see you smile, so. Thank you.
Hi. There are a lot of courageous points in the book where you approach family members and friends about their stories. And I just wondered if you got any kind of feedback on your final book from any of those people and what that was like.
Yeah, in a way, you know, I never felt courageous when I was writing the book because the main protagonists that I'm focusing on in the book are, you know, have died a long time ago. So I didn't have to confront them and their reactions. And I have a very close relationship to my own immediate family, my parents and my aunt on my mother's side of the family. So they were supportive of the project from the beginning. And they also were curious to find out what I found out, because when they could have done the research that I did, they didn't have the same technological tools available. So they couldn't have found out nearly as much as I was able to find out about our family. So they were really cheering me on in a way and curious about what I'd find out. But I think they also had a certain amount of trust in me, knowing that my goal was never to put quick blame on somebody or to excuse somebody, you know, neither of those two, but to just understand better what traces war leaves on families over generations. And then that more remote side of the family, my father's side of the family, who I'd met for the first time while working on the book. I mean, I wanted to be fair to them, so I told them from the beginning that I'm working on a book about our family and the war. So I didn't meet them under false pretenses. And they were very nice and open, but I don't think they knew that they would, or their family members would feature as protagonists in the book. And I was very nervous about what my my estranged aunt would think. I sent them all the book when it was published, and unfortunately she passed away a few months after the book came out. So I don't know whether she read it and what she thought, but she was very open, you know, about talking about her dead brother. And she also, I asked her if I could publish the photographs that she had shown me in my book, and she agreed to that too. So despite this family feud is probably too dramatic a word, but rift, she was very generous and open, which I appreciated. And then I heard back from my male cousin, and he responded very positively to the book. And you know, was happy to learn about his own family. I have heard that in this tiny village of Kulsheim there are conflicting perspectives on the book. I haven't gone there for a reading yet. I don't know if I should or not, but yeah, so I don't know what other people in that village think about it.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about your artistic influences and inspirations, both in the non-cartooning world and maybe some cartoonists that inspire you, just from like the graphic novel point of view.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, there are many people I obviously admire and read. And beginning with graphic novelists, I think there are two people whose work I admire most. One is Chris Ware. I loved his book, Jimmy Corrigan, just the way he conveys emotion in a very subtle and non-sentimental way, and also how he thinks about history as just part of our, I don't know, the human experience. I don't know if he would talk about his own work like that, but and then also a Flemish illustrator called Olivier Schrauven, who did a book called My Boy, and also Arsène Schrauven, who's just a very, very experimental storyteller, and I love how he's breaking the traditional boundaries of the graphic novel. And of course, I'm inspired by anybody who does, who does nonfiction work, visual nonfiction work in the comics world. But I have to say, while I was working on the book, I didn't read so many graphic novels. I focused more on nonfiction writing without images, memoirs. For instance, Alexandra Fuller is one, nonfiction writer who I like a lot, again, because she conveys emotion without sentimentality and in very non-direct ways. And then also essayistic documentary films, so documentary films that have a poetic quality, or films by Werner Herzog, for instance, where the filmmaker is as much the protagonist as the actual subject of the film. And then in terms of the fine arts, I love the German expressionists, George Grosz, Otto Dix, partly because of the way they work visually, but also because of the subjects they addressed in between the wars, and basically making a case against war. So there was definitely a pacifist agenda to their drawings, and that's something I can really relate to.
Hi, thanks so much for being here. So you had mentioned that this monograph had been translated into a few languages, is that right? So aside from English, I'm assuming it's also been translated into German? What other languages has it been translated in? Because I was curious when you were responding to Professor Smith's question about the hand lettering and talking about color, and I wanted to ask about the color palette that you chose for the book and how that shifts across national contexts.
It's a great question. So it's coming out in 16 countries, and most recently it was sold to China and Korea, and also Lithuania and Ukraine. And I'm always curious about, how the narrative is perceived differently based on those countries' different perceptions of the war. In terms of, so it came out in Germany first last year, and I translated it myself, but in the other countries, obviously, I have nothing to do with the translation, only with the text layout. But the colors, you mean how they culturally work or don't work, or do you mean just technically with the printers and? Okay. Mm-hmm. That's a really great question. I've never thought about that. I probably should. It's probably too late. But I don't know how it'll read in other countries. I mean, the only thing I can or two things I can say that probably don't answer your question, but about the color. One is that I basically relied on two different color schemes. So one for the paternal side of the family and one for the maternal one. And you can see it in the end papers, which are the family tree. So in the front is my mother's family tree, which is kept in cold colors, while in the back you see my father's side of the family, which is kept in in warm colors. And that's not for emotional reasons, but because I needed two contrasting color schemes, schemes to make it easier for the reader to switch back and forth, even if they didn't consciously notice that, but I thought it would help untangle the two different family stories. But but then I also kept the protagonist in, so my maternal grandfather and my uncle on my father's family side, I made them, so in the cold story, I made my grandfather a little bit warmer, and in the warm story, I made my uncle a little bit colder, so that the protagonist would stand out on the page and you would immediately recognize him. And the other thing about color, sometimes I'm asked, and it always surprises me a little bit, is why it's such a colorful book, you know, as if books about the past should only be in black and white. And, you know, we always experience, you know, life. I mean, unless we're colorblind, we always experience life in colors, and our memory is very colorful too. And so I don't see a reason to do this other than for, you know, economic reasons to do this in black and white. But that didn't answer your question. I have to think about it.
So again, thank you so much for your book. We read a couple of chapters of your book in my graphic novel class, and we read it along with the final chapters of Mouse, which is another story sort of about the war. And in these final chapters of Mouse, there's this one panel that shows a German among the victims of the war, like among the people who suffered. And then we read chapters of your book that is about all of those people, right? So it was quite a contrast, and we talked briefly about how delicate it is to talk about the pain of Germans afterwards, right? So I was wondering if, when you navigated that discussion or that story, you had any consultation with organizations that deal with memory or history, or if you have received any feedback from organizations that deal with that.
Thank you. I haven't, I mean, I didn't seek out conversations prior to writing the book about that subject. I know there's a lot, you know, a lot has been written about memory studies and also the visual components and material culture in connection to memory studies. And I just attended the German Studies Association conference in Portland, where, you know, people think and write about these things all the time, but I think I wanted to free myself from having to think so hard about these things and approach it on a more intuitive level for myself. I mean, it's a subject I'm very interested in learning more about, and I've had a few conversations since the book came out about these things. Yeah, I think what you mentioned before, you know, depicting or writing about German loss it was the hardest thing for me when working on the project. So it was much harder than actually figuring out what happened in my family, which I just felt was both my responsibility and a natural urge to do. But then how to talk about it was much, much harder. And because my greatest fear was that people might misunderstand my book as a way of victimizing. You know, I don't like to think of Germans as victims because most supported the regime. And so, you know, they brought this upon themselves. And so my biggest fear was, but of course there were Germans who were also persecuted. You know, I'm not saying that that there weren't any people who suffered under the Nazi regime, non-Jewish Germans, but it was very difficult, especially in moments where I had previously not allowed myself to feel anything as a German. And now I felt like if I wrote a book about this, I had to be you know, when you write a memoir, you have to be honest and confront your own feelings, even if they're uncomfortable. And so feeling sad over, you know, my grandfather's brother's loss. He was not a believer in the Nazi ideology, but nonetheless, I never allowed myself to feel sad about his death until I read his letters while doing the research of the book. And the letters were so heartbreaking, and that I really, you know, I felt for him and for his family. And he disappeared in the war in Russia. And so I didn't know how to illustrate those pages because I didn't want to make it I didn't want to make it sentimental. And so that was one instance where I actually used kind of a very removed or very faded image when addressing those letters, because I felt like I needed something that was subtle and yeah, just not too overpowering. And I think about that a lot, you know, about the relationship between images and text. And it's also similar to film, where, you know, when you compare it to music, I mean, even pop music, or, you know, where musicians or composers always have to think about how to combine music with words. And it's the same with images, that it just has to be weighed in the right way. And yeah, there shouldn't be a hierarchy, but at the same time, you just need to be careful that it's not, yeah. I mean, you know, when you look at documentaries, for instance, about the Second World War, and you listen to the music they use in Germany is so entirely different from the music they use in England in documentaries about the war. Because, you know, in Germany it's always gloomy sounding music, and in England it's often a bit more heroic. And so it's similar with the images. I just have to find the right balance. And W.G. Sebald actually wrote a book, I don't know if it was in the 80s or early 90s, about the Germans' difficulty of talking about German loss and the Second World War. And I think it's called On the Natural History of Destruction. So that's also an interesting read, maybe.
So it's a beautiful book, and it's caused me to sort of reflect on the relationship between ethics and aesthetics and form and content. And one of the things that's striking about your uncle's handwriting, contrary to his school teacher, his calligraphy is beautiful, but the thing it expresses is somewhat ugly. And I wondered if that was possibly what people were pushing back at, is it's a beautiful book about something very difficult. But it seemed to me that one of the things that's so wonderful about it is that often we impose or attempt to impose coherence in memoir, and this is by virtue of the style as well as the content, fragmentary, glued together, as you allude to right at the very end. And I wanted to know if you had any thoughts about that.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly one of the main reasons for why I chose this visual format. Something is squeaking. I don't know if it's me or I chose this collage-like nature for this book because I thought a lot about the nature of memory as a fragmentary thing, as something that we always think of as linear, but it's actually not. It's only the narrative we apply to it in retrospect that is linear. And so, but at the same time, despite its fragmentary nature, and there's an inner logic to it. And I think that's what I try to convey with the images, the fragmentation, and also the deconstruction of stereotypical ideas I had about the war or the German war experience. So I think deconstruction is also a big part or a big component that I thought about, and also making things fade. So not only creating something, but taking it away. So there are several references to blankness, innocence as a utopia in a way, and I reflect that in the images as well. And another thing that these pages that I talked about earlier from the Notebook of a Homesick Emigre, and from, now I forgot the title of the other one, the flea market ones and the encyclopedic pages, I interspersed my family narrative with those pages in order to take the reader out of the narrative and make it, if not uncomfortable, just to shift the focus back onto a collective level. Because I think one other thing I learned from working on this book is that the collective and the personal are just deeply connected. You can't separate them. And also the collective memory of war and the collective effort of memorializing the war is very connected to the personal one. And so I try to interrupt the personal narrative by inserting those more collective experiences perhaps of German cultural identity that also related to my family, but also took the reader away from the personal again.
Thank you for being here. I was wondering about your choice of the cover, because you started out talking about how you didn't have access to these national myths and myths of nation making. And it really reminds me of German romantic paintings like The Wanderer. And I was wondering if that was intentional, and because you have a pensive person staring off into German landscape. So why that, and where do you land on belonging? What is the sense of belonging at the end of the story?
Okay. So you were referring to this painting, which is, I think, Wanderer Above a Sea of Fog by Caspar David Friedrich, which is a really iconic German painting. And I was alluding to this painting in the cover, and for many different reasons. I mean, one reason was because the book is about looking and about looking back from a distance, and that's both, in my case, both a historic distance, because there's a generation in between the war and my generation, and also the geographic distance, because I've been living abroad for 20 years. And without those two distances, I don't think I would have written the book or reflected about my heritage and my family history to that degree. And so to me, the Friedrich painting seemed to convey that notion. And what I also realized when going to the flea markets was I looked through a lot of old family albums to look for recurring visual themes, because I was wondering about what that would say about German cultural identity, at least the way it was perceived over, you know, the 20th century. And I really found so many photographs of people posing in landscapes and looking at a landscape from behind. I mean, being, you know, pictured from behind. And I don't know if that's a specifically German thing, but I was really intrigued by that. And it made me wonder if all of these photographers have maybe been influenced by this Caspar David Friedrich painting, or if the Caspar David Friedrich painting was influenced by something that's a bigger cultural German experience, which is maybe this quest for identity, which dates back before the two world wars, because Germany became a nation so late compared to, you know, England and France. So I wonder if there's always been a struggle to define who one is, because we, you know, we didn't have this great empire, you know, in quotation marks. And so so it's a bit of a mystery to me, but I use this this thing as a recurring motif, and all of the publishers in the other countries have used it as well, but with variations. So for the American edition, we actually removed the walking stick because I felt like, you know, people are not as familiar with the painting as they are in Germany, and I didn't want it to be misunderstood as a book about knee surgery, for instance, because every little detail you put into a drawing is read, you know, is interpreted in one way or another. And then this background here is actually a postcard from 1900 that I found in an antique bookstore in Germany, in my hometown. And it's a photograph of the Black Forest. And when you open up the book, on the inside flap, you actually see that over here is a big rock, and there's a man sitting there with a backpack. So there was this man sitting there in 1900 looking at the same landscape that I'm looking at now. And I was just so intrigued by this idea of how, you know, what he felt about his home, and how it's changed since the two world wars. And but then the Americans, for the paperback edition, which just came out, they actually went with the foreign edition cover, which most other countries have adapted, which does not have any photographs, and it has a sketch-like interpretation of a landscape, which to me represents this idea that I can't quite define what home is, which leads me to the second part of your question, which was about whether I have found any answer to you know, this question of belonging. And I think just as the book was never an attempt of you know, coming, you know, not feeling less guilty, for instance, it was also not an attempt of pinning down what German identity is, because I think it shouldn't be one thing, you know, that's defined at a particular time for one particular people. I mean, that's exactly what the Nazis did. So it should be something, it should be a term that should be, you know, changeable and flexible, and that also naturally changes as societies change. And also a term that everybody should be able to define for themselves. And so I personally have not found a real conclusion. I mean, because I've lived abroad for 20 years, I do associate it mostly with my childhood. So the sense of belonging to to Germany as a home, or the German term Heimat, to me is so deeply tied to my childhood. And in that way, it's something that I feel is part of the past, which, you know, is sad in some ways, but it's also natural in others, because when you leave that familiar space, you adapt, and it's, I think, a survival instinct, and it's necessary. So yeah, I don't have a clear answer to that question.
I'm 78, and so I came into the world at a time when my grandparents had gone through World War I. And at that time, it was deeply distressing to certain parts of the polity about the Germans, and all sorts of things like, it wasn't so much Huns as Krauts or something like that. And in the 1940s and so on, and some little bit of privation and time in terms of the food, lack of a variety and things like that in Illinois, where they lived at the time. And because they had studied in Kansas, and they had spoken German, and they liked German, they read German things, they liked Heine and different things. And to them, you know, this whole German thing at that time was considerably different in terms of the way my grandparents thought of it, and they had to suppress all of that. And it got even worse in the Second World War. And so at the time I began to study German in the 60s, my conception of this was quite different. You know, it was beginning to, because of the European Commonwealth, and I had been filing documents in the European Commonwealth, I began to have, and United Nations, I began to have a totally different sense of the world, I think, and what should be national totally. So that, I think, is something in this world, in the global society we live in today. We have to really ask ourselves different questions, I think, about where we belong. We all belong with the climate crisis and everything. I think we're in a different place.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. And obviously the idea of cultural belonging always changes, and the perception of German culture has shifted and changed dramatically over the decades. And my hope also with this book was that there is a universal read to it, where it's not only a book, hopefully, about my family or about Germany, but about anybody's responsibility to look back at one's country's past and trying to understand what we do with that now, and also accepting the fact that we're made of it. I mean, I feel like there's an incredible amount of short-term memory going on, where there's this, I mean, sense of almost forgetting that the way we are now is because of what happened before, or not fully recognizing that people of color being treated, being killed on the street by police, and there's no charge, that of course there's a direct relationship to slavery. I mean it's so obvious, but I think it's, yeah, I mean, it's hopefully a universal question that that we all have a responsibility to face our past and learn from it in constructive ways.
Just a few more notes before you go. We have a couple of cultural offerings that we wanted to tell you about before we say thanks to Nora for this great evening. There is a small pop-up exhibit that was curated by Clara Drummond in Special Collections, and it is centered on, it was inspired by belonging. The pop-up is called the Memory Archives. It's on display in the back case of the exhibition space in our Special Collections Library right down the hall here. It shares items from Penn State's collections that spoke to the themes in belonging as an example of how every historical collection is its own memory archive waiting to be explored. So if you'd like to explore it, come by Special Collections Library anytime when it's open between now and January 12th of next year. And one more cultural note, there is a play happening right now on campus that could be of interest to comics aficionados. Tomorrow night is the last showing of the wonderful Penn State Center Stage comedy, She Kills Monsters. It has Dungeons and Dragons, 90s pop culture, and love between two sisters, and it's at the Playhouse tomorrow night at 7:30. Now, don't forget, we have a book signing happening here and a book sale. You can buy your own copy of Belonging. We want to thank you for your questions, and let's all give a big thank you to Nora for an incredible presentation. Thank you so much, everybody.